Chapter 2. What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he lose one of them, doth not leave the 99 in the wilderness, and go after that which is lost, until he find it? Mamma paused in her reading to have a sip of water, and Rebecca wondered, for not the first time in her life, if she had learned her oratory style when she learned school teaching, or if, as it seemed with Anna Lee, she had been born with an ear for variation that enabled her to vivify passages that in other voices were nearly always rendered dull. Rebecca's was one of those voices. And when he hath found it, he layeth it on his shoulders, rejoicing. Rebecca looked up from her embroidery to the parlor desk where John sat writing his letters. His back was turned to her, not quite so straight as it ought to have been, were he a stickler for a medically correct posture. Of course, propriety wasn't always becoming in a man, as he reminded her on occasion, and she smiled at the memory of his slinging her over his shoulders like said lost lamb to carry her across the threshold when they were first married. So much for the fairy-tale image of a damsel held daintily in the arms of her prince. She weighed substantially more than those ethereal princesses, he told her in his arch way, and had earned both a slap on the arm and a kiss. He didn't play so much any more, nor even kiss as often as he used to, when she thought about it, which she tried to avoid. Either what woman, having 10 pieces of silver, if she lose one, doth not light a candle, and sweep the house, and seek diligently until she find it? Rebecca caught the blue thread's needle on the underside of her hoop, and penned it aside, so she could finish the set of stitches with red. Lord help her if she ever lost such a coin. The last time she'd been able to sweep a house without either tiring out, choking, or having the family insist that she not exert herself, Lucy had been just old enough to start getting underfoot, crawling under tables, then trying to run and plopping down in the middle of a dust pile when she stumbled over herself. Now she was big enough to sit, if not quiet and still, then at least with only a soft hum of the songs she invented as she played with her doll. The time that separated those images of the child had left Rebecca with few memories that were not second-hand. She had been in a laudanum sleep when Lucy reached so many of her milestones, or else too intent on nursing the pride she hadn't even realized she possessed after the surgery so completely changed her. She had lost so much time, was losing more every day, and that was something no amount of searching could ever bring back. Her chest tightened at the idea that in not much more than a year, the rest of Lucy's childhood, indeed her life, would almost certainly be lost to her as well. That tightness came not only from the thought, she realized with a dread that had become all too familiar in the past months, but also from the very illness that was stealing her time. She willed herself to relax, to swallow and try again to breathe, for conscious effort had sometimes warded off attacks before. That breathlessness she got when she laughed or cried uncontrollably, that panicked intensity that had caused her early in their marriage to ban John from ever including tickling in their play, could be calmed if she could only concentrate on pretending it didn't exist. But it wouldn't go away this time, and if she wanted to avoid the scene of familial over-concern that would inevitably come were she to interrupt Mamma's reading with one of her coughing fits, she would have to leave the parlor and close herself off in another far-away room where they wouldn't hear. So with as much nonchalance as she could put into a hurried withdrawal, she lay her embroidery on the table and, keeping her head down, as though the posture would keep anyone from seeing the strain of containment in her red face and teary eyes, stepped toward the door, where just as she crossed the threshold, a single cough escaped her before she strangled off its successor. She got to the bottom of the stairs before she could hold herself no longer, and let forth the explosion into the arm that held the banister. She pulled herself up, step by labored step, until John appeared to flank her, his hand under her other arm as a guide. She had not gone far enough away, and as she turned toward him to brace herself against the railing, she saw that the rest of the family had formed in a rank at the bottom of the stairs, ready to act as reinforcements. She waved them off, and with a final heave, drove the fit into its slackening phase. "I'm fine," she said after clearing her throat one last time, and forcing John to release her so she could continue on alone, turned to make as graceful a retreat as a defeated woman could muster. Friday, 18 November 1853. This is probably the latest, or earliest, I've ever written an entry. Father woke us up a little before midnight and had me scared the house was on fire when he held my coat for me and said to go outside. But there was nothing wrong. Mother and Will and Caroline were already out in the yard looking up at the sky. There were a few clouds out, but in the clearings we could see a whole host of fallen stars. We all stood watching them for a few minutes, shooting this way and that, appearing out of nothing and returning to nothing. Mother said she never could see a meteor shower without thinking of the judgment, of fire falling from the sky. Father said it put him in mind of the opposite end of time, of Lucifer and his fallen army being thrown out of heaven. Angels are bright still, though the brightest fell, he said, and then he asked me what that was from. When I admitted I didn't know, he shook his head. Macbeth, Teague. Study to show thyself approved refers to more than the Scripture in this house. To be a man of understanding you must not say, I don't know, but rather say, I shall learn. I didn't say anything back, since it probably would have come out disrespectful. I don't like Macbeth, so why should I want to put it to memory? It's such a gloomy story. The man was miserable as an evil king, but he couldn't turn back to being good if he wanted. What is it he said? I am in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er. I wish Father knew I remembered those lines. After a few minutes, Father spoke again. What do you think of 'em, Teague? I didn't want to say that I didn't know again, even though I hadn't thought to give any meaning to the meteor shower. So I watched a few more burn out before I said anything. It's like God has a knife in one hand and a threaded needle in the other, I said, and he cuts a little slit between heaven and the world to let us see the light of his city just long enough for us to know it's there, and then he sews up the slit straight away before the light can blind us. The stars are like that too, little pinpricks big enough to hint that there's something on the other side of the dark. Father smiled and said, I like that. Then he told us it was time we went back to bed, but I stayed up to write this entry. I was afraid if I waited until morning I would forget what I said that impressed him. John's head ached, but he continued staring at the close-set words in the book he'd found lying on a lamp table in the music room. He made no pretense of reading it, and was only vaguely aware of its title. It was one of the latest Dickens novels, Great Expectations. He'd heard something to the effect that it was a rather maudlin tale of a young man's exercises in futility, and though it fit his mood, he had no interest in it. He had taken off his collar and thrown it on the floor beside his corner chair. The sun in its late afternoon descent shone through the window at his shoulder, and had started an uncomfortable burning sensation at the top of his right ear and down along his jawline. He started to put his hand up to shield his ear, but instead exposed his entire face to the sun as he turned at a tiny tapping noise on the window. What must have been the season's first wasp was butting its head against the glass, flitting up and down over the surface almost as if it were testing for weaknesses in this invisible barrier. You don't want in here, my friend, John muttered. He wondered if a wasp could see like a man, and what it saw through the window that was worth getting a headache over. John rapped on the window with a finger, and was disappointed, almost contemptuous, when the wasp flew away. Coward, he whispered. When he turned away from the window, his eyes happened on his reflection in the mirror on the wall. He held the gaze with himself only a few seconds before staring again at the book. Another tapping sound, this time coming down the hall and stopping short at the music-room door, caused John to glance over to a figure not too much shorter than himself when it stiffened to an upright position, instead of remaining on its customary slouch on the pair of crutches. I'm sorry, Teague said. I didn't realize anyone was in here. Teague, John called out. He motioned for the younger man to sit, but then merely put the book down and leaned forward with his hands crossed between his knees. John sat like this for several moments, and it was only after Teague began shifting in his chair that he spoke. How are you feeling? Teague's eyebrows furrowed as if he hadn't expected the question. About the same. And your medication, it's working? Teague hesitated. I've had to increase the amount a bit, 2 at a time. You should have asked one of us before doing that. Just don't push it up to 3. All right, Teague said. At least there's something I can do for you. John leaned his chin on his fist and looked out to where the wasp had been. It hadn't come back. He shut his eyes. My wife is very sick, you know. Yes. John stared at him. Yes, he repeated, and looked back to his reflection in the mirror. Again, he didn't hold the gaze long before he rose, patted Teague's shoulder, and left the room. Sunday, 19 February, 1854. This has been the worst birthday I've ever had, not even barring the one when my right arm was in a sling. Andy Hopkins tripped Nancy when she was bringing in the pie and made her spill it all over him. She might have turned a bit in mid-fall so that it would be sure to hit him, but it was no more than he deserved for purposely sticking out his foot. He threw such a tantrum that Father heard the commotion from the next room. I told him what had happened, but he took Andy's part, even though the little snake all but called me a liar. He promised to punish Nancy, for, according to Andy, she dumped it on purpose. I stomped out of the party with no stomach to endure such injustice, but instead of allowing me to fume in private, Father forced me back to entertain our guests for the duration. It was only after the boys had gone that Father explained why he had acted so unfairly. It was uncouth, he said, to doubt the word of a guest, particularly when it involved a slave's behavior. He knew I had spoken the truth, but said I must learn to contain my temper in the interests of diplomacy. Diplomacy be hanged, I told him, earning myself a boxed ear for the slang. Father thinks it is enough that he won't really punish Nancy, but I do not see the Christian virtue in allowing a liar to believe he successfully played a cruel joke on an innocent girl. He says I'll understand by and by, but I certainly hope not.